Yeah, so basically almost everybody in the room knows me, but I'm just going to dive in and try to make this quick. Especially since we have a small crew, I'm happy to discuss any of the stuff beyond the talk. And if you saw my job talk 4 years ago, this is more or less an updated version with a lot of things that I said were next steps. Many of those things have happened, so I guess that's a good thing. But in any case, what my research focuses on are really two areas. One is sort of the identification of disparities and what I would say are sort of mechanisms or mediating variables of racial ethnic disparities with a focus on stress and contextual variables and an eye towards refining measurement. And the second is really an intervention arm that I'll talk about in the second half of this. We're going to start with the identifying mechanisms, and this is the stuff that I've been working on publishing more in, but this is starting to shift. This is also what my Cobra project focuses on. So a large part of this work, is, like I said, is really focused on race ethnicity, particularly Hispanic, Latino, Latinx populations, and comparisons across immigrants. And one of the primary areas that I look at is what's called trauma exposure. So definitions of trauma really vary. The one that I tend to use is very similar to the DSM definition. So, were you afraid for, seriously afraid for your own safety or the safety of others, more or less? It gets a little bit more technical. I'm happy to discuss that a little bit further. But for the time being, it's important to think of this as basically an incredibly terrifying event, at least as a shorthand for now. So looking at the way that race, ethnicity, and immigration status might lead to increased trauma exposure, and the way that increased trauma exposure might lead to increased disorder prevalence and severity seems rather obvious. There aren't a whole lot of people actually doing this work and showing these linkages. But as we see in a paper that I published actually right before I came here, that is effectively what we see. And if you look, you can see the disparities in trauma exposure aren't actually that great. And I wish I'd actually put that up, the indirect effects here. But even small trauma exposure disparities lead to pretty significant disparities in mental health outcomes, because the relationship between trauma exposure and mental health outcomes is just that strong. And that's kind of what that was supposed to tell that I forgot was in there. Importantly for this though, it's not just that there's this difference in trauma exposure, but knowing that we have these disparities in income and poverty rates, it's important to consider the role that poverty plays. So it's not just that Latinos and African Americans, the study also included testing of these outcomes among African Americans, experience poverty at a higher rate, but that poverty also increases the effect of trauma exposure on mental health outcomes. And so this is going to feel very similar as I go across more recent results, but taking a step back, what this suggests is these poverty, low resource environments may increase that relationship that I'm sort of spelling out here. All right.
Okay. All right.
So don't panic.
Now we're getting there.
So this is sort of that next step in trying to move toward a much more longitudinal model. And this is actually taken from a study that I published relatively recently. But it's just what's called a cross-lagged autoregressive model. Once you break it down into its component parts, it's really not super scary. So you've got, in this study, we've got delinquency, polyvictimization, and PTSD as our sort of year one variables. And then we repeat those variables across 2 subsequent years. And then more or less what we try to do, polyvictimization is a measure of trauma exposure. Probably should have mentioned that. What we try to do is look at the degree to which trauma exposure then predicts subsequent symptoms, including PTSD and delinquent behavior among youth, and the degree to which the reverse is true, so that these symptoms actually increase the risk prospectively of trauma exposure, this polyvictimization variable, even after we control for the fact that these people may have already experienced traumatic event exposure. And so we build from that and try to understand, okay, what are the racial and ethnic disparities when we look at that? And if you remember, so those initial effects that I showed, which were, we were to cover up these last two and just to look right here on the left side. This is more or less what I showed initially, except it's this bottom portion right here. So we've got this mediational framework where African Americans and Hispanic Latinx folks experience more polyvictimization, which leads to more PTSD or post-traumatic stress symptoms. But we want to expand beyond that and try to get a better sense of what's the long-term consequence of that. And more or less what this is trying to get at is each of these darkened pathways are actually significant. So even at baseline, we see these disparities in trauma exposure and delinquency, and those subsequently create a cascade of additional effects, ultimately leading to even greater polyvictimization or trauma exposure disparities, even greater PTSD disparities, and even greater delinquency disparities. And this is a lot of testing, indirect effects, but I promise even all the way up to these very specific indirect effects, this pathway where we've got this increased risk of exposure leading all the way up to here, and ultimately the disparities in those symptom outcomes is significant. So the take-home message here that it's much more simplified is these initial disparities in trauma exposure and polyvictimization really take off and accelerate disparities across not only more trauma exposure and polyvictimization, but additional mental health symptoms. All right. Going even a little bit more complicated, but this gets at some of those contextual factors that I was talking about. So in one of the prior studies, we looked at poverty as a contextual factor that increased the effect of trauma or polyvictimization. In this case, we're looking at poverty and other sort of contextual family-related variables as mediators. Pretty busy, but the take-home message is all of these contextual factors that we might think of as increasing risk for exposure do, but importantly, they're also accounting for basically all of the disparities in initial trauma exposure or polyvictimization. So once we account for all of this, we stop seeing significant disparities in polyvictimization. With me so far? Okay, so that's most of that aim. This again kind of shows the cascading effect. I meant to move this slide up, so I apologize. Going back, same message. Those disparities lead to accelerating disparities in trauma exposure. Okay, so that was sort of the identification of those disparities, and a little bit of stress and contextual variables is, or at least stressful event exposure and contextual variables is exacerbating mental health symptom disparities. But importantly, within that, we have a fair amount of limitations of the measurement that we use, particularly among Hispanic and Latinx immigrants, which is this next data I'm going to show you. This is again something I published before coming here, but we've expanded on since. Actually, no, this got published while I was here. Strike that. What I published right after coming here, as I collaborated with a group, what we did was we took standard trauma assessments, and a large part of this study is really trying to understand the limitations of those assessments with immigrants, and particularly the extent to which it captures traumatic events that occur during the process of immigration. So in this prior study, this is with adolescents. When we do the standard trauma assessment, and after each one of the questions, like has anyone ever forced you to have sex when you did not want to? Those kinds of questions. Right after that, we say, did that happen during the process of immigration? When we do that, and there are some 30 different trauma assessment items, we got a total of 6 disclosures out of about 120 people. So, you know, not that tiny, but not that big. But then we added an immigration-specific module where it's, all right, now I'm going to talk to you about immigration and ask, during the process of immigration, did you fear that you might be seriously injured or killed, or that someone you love might be seriously injured or killed? And with that, we get 32 additional disclosures. And once we really work through trying to piece these apart and making sure that none of these disclosures could be attributable to any of those other events, what we wind up with is 28 people, or about a quarter of our samples that basically are saying that the process of immigration itself was traumatic, that I didn't experience any of the violence or any of those other things, nothing like that. It's the process of immigration that is traumatic. Once we pull that piece out, what we see is that experiencing immigration as traumatic actually increases the odds of both depression and PTSD. Again, this is in adolescence, and that developmental portion is important to take into consideration. But nonetheless, these are pretty substantive results. This really is at least associated with much higher likelihood of somebody meeting criteria for depression or PTSD. And then
Sorry, something that I'm curious about. So in your immigration process as traumatic measure, can you tell us a little bit more about the nature of that measure? So are you asking people about these different aspects of their immigration that could potentially be interpreted as traumatic or not traumatic? Or are you, like, depending on the person, or are you asking about things that pretty universally would be considered traumatic and asking, did this happen during immigration? Like you just said, did you fear for your life? That's like pretty universally traumatic.
Right.
You know,
so
happened during immigration or not.
This is kind of getting at both. The only thing we didn't do here, and in the study I'm about to show you, I still haven't changed for just community engagement reasons, is we don't ask about things that we suspect make the immigration experience traumatic, like did you cross via the US-Mexico land border, since that's going to be perceived as basically a question about documentation status. And we also don't ask related things about like weather exposure, that kind of thing. But what I'd come back to is kind of this, is we take this really thorough trauma assessment that's about all of these discrete events. And then at the very end has that typical other category. It's like, are any other experiences where you significantly fear for your own safety or the safety of others, right? And in each one after each one of those items, which is about 30 items long, a little bit more if you count sub items, but roughly 30 items long, there's where we get the 6 disclosures. And then what I'm referring to here, these are the people who said, I feared for my safety and the safety of others, and we can't find another explanation for why that is anywhere else in the trauma assessment. Right? And so then when we look at this, it's those 28 people compared to everybody else who are experiencing these higher odds. And I should also mention, this is while controlling for exposure to sexual assault, physical assault, polyvictimization.
Sort of traditional traumatizing.
Yeah, what you would expect in any other epi study, trauma epi study, predicting depression and PTSD. Control for all of that, add this immigration, those 28 people.
Those other 8 people, right?
Yeah, basically. So we're trying to get a clean effect of just immigration as traumatic. What does that look like? And this is what we see.
So for those 4 other people, you attributed their distress to something else outside the process of immigration?
Yeah, we're able to say maybe it occurred during immigration, but it's physical assault or it's sexual assault or something like that. And so it's not, we couldn't say it's immigration itself, but that maybe it's just the effect of you experienced a sexual assault, and we know that is traumatic. So having experienced that during immigration maybe isn't, it's interesting how often that might happen during immigration.
But it happens outside of immigration.
Right, but its effect by itself isn't necessarily that interesting. I mean, in terms of its contribution to the literature, should clarify that.
Careful.
Yeah, it's not that, that finding would not be novel, right? The idea that sexual assault contributes to increases in mental health symptoms. Okay. So we're in the process of doing a similar study. We've got about 80 people now. Our official numbers were 82, 83 as of today, whatever. So we ran somebody today.
Yeah, so 80 right now, and then she's scheduling the next together.
Okay, so 80 right now, and this is very preliminary data. There's some other pieces to this that I'm particularly interested in that tries to map this immigration process trauma onto other trauma assessment measures. And so we have them recount their immigration experience, and we collect basically mood state before and after to see if it changes, and then collect some physiological measurement. May not be the absolute best device to measure it. I will acknowledge that that's what we're working with for the time being. It's a Empatica E4 that we're using at the moment, but it includes that, and then adding on additional measures of discrimination, with the thought being that discrimination is potentially a reminder of immigration, because people are often targets of discrimination because of their perceived immigration status. So you have this negative, persistent reminder of potentially a traumatic event. Similarly with authorities, that if you went through a very harsh immigration experience, we think potentially trying to avoid authorities, or because of problems with human rights protections and things like that, you might be more apt to say you don't trust the people around you now. Yeah, and then we're trying to retain these folks for potentially longitudinal data on some of these things. Okay, so here's the data that I just looked at about, I don't know what time it is, but I'm gonna guess about 2 hours ago. So similar thing, slight change here where we go through the entire standard trauma assessment, and then just for simplicity, so it doesn't take like an hour and a half just to administer this one measure, we reach the end of that and say, any of these things that you just mentioned, did any of those occur during immigration? And of the roughly 80 people we have, we get 9 disclosures. So proportionally, it's a bit more than what we had in the adolescent sample. It's roughly double proportionally. But again, we have this immigration-specific module that is very similar to that other immigration-specific module. We get 31 total disclosures about people fearing for their safety during the process of immigration. And when we factor out those 9, all of those 9 did say that they feared for their safety or the safety of others during immigration. We get 22 people out of 80. So again, we're in that a quarter of our sample, maybe slightly more, very similar to the adolescent sample, a quarter saying, we can't attribute it to anything else, immigration is traumatic. And also super preliminary data, doing some very quick linear regressions. So far, those disclosures are significantly predictive of PTSD symptoms, even after we account for some other discrete traumatic events. I'll be honest, I didn't have time to do a really thorough analysis of this yet. So these are super preliminary, but this is what we've got so far. And we'll continue recruiting and see how it develops from here. But what this suggests is these data are fairly consistent with what we had in the adolescent sample, which is, especially because this is an adult sample, makes it really meaningful that it may not be just constrained to when people are immigrating or factors like that, or that one adolescent sample. This does seem to be a pretty replicable finding across Hispanic Latinx immigrants. Okay, this is going to feel like, and now for something completely different, which is some of the next steps with the RDAR Center and my Cobre project, which I do feel like I'll spend a bit of time on, seems appropriate given this context. And basically this spends a fair amount of what I've been doing in trying to understand the relationship between traumatic event exposure and mental health symptoms, and some of the pretty nascent physiological stress measurement that's in my own research, but applying it to substance use. And so in this case, what we're doing, what will be hopefully, assuming research doesn't get shut down with the ongoing plague, we will we'll be bringing people into the lab and having them undergo a pretty standard stress induction task. We get salivary stress hormone collection as they're going through the stress induction to see basically how much their stress peaks and how well they're able to sort of self-regulate and have that stress come down. That in of itself, not super novel. It's a very standard procedure. But what I'll do after that is the potentially more novel thing that's actually trying to combine that with what's called ecological momentary assessment. And so this is getting at how well does that stress induction, that stress response, actually predict how stressed people are reporting they are in their day-to-day lives, and how much we see peaks and valleys in their mood from day to day. But even more importantly for this, how much that then translates to increased substance use, and particularly how much it alters that relationship between affect and substance use. So if somebody is less able to regulate their stress responses, the main hypothesis here is that's going to make it to where experiencing that stress is going to make it more likely that they're going to use. And that's the more novel piece that, at least so far as I've seen in the literature, hasn't been tested. But tying it back into kind of where I've been before, these are all potential mechanisms for why we see these really robust and consistent effects for violence exposure, predicting substance use, both when people start to use, how much they're using, and even the likelihood of recovery once they enter into treatment. So I don't have a clock on me.
You're at 30 minutes.
Man, I'm doing well on time. Okay. So that was sort of the mechanisms of disparities and really thinking about stress, trauma exposure, these contextual factors, refinement of measurement. But I also want to talk about my other arm of what I do, and really trying to think about the fact that, okay, we know now there are these violence exposure disparities. We know that there are these PTSD disparities, if nothing else, among adolescents, and that we see this increased violence exposure among a lot of Latinx populations. So what do we do about that? How do we actually translate that into getting people into treatment? And the reality is that a lot of the problems with treatment don't necessarily have that much to do with the trauma exposure. They do a little bit, but our biggest barriers to treatment are actually these really systemic barriers. There are others, I don't want to minimize those, but these seem to be some of the most consistent. When we go out and actually ask, particularly Latinx immigrants, like who have mental health disorders, like, would you seek care if you could? What has kept you from seeking care? And actually in one study that I collaborated on, total number of people who said I wouldn't go if I had the money or if I had insurance, 0 out of about 150. Everybody who had a disorder said, I would love that, but they don't speak my language, it costs too much money, and I don't have insurance. Now, this was obviously, not obviously, this was also pre-ACA implementation, so maybe some of those barriers are reduced. There is some evidence that that might be the case, but large in part, those barriers are still in place.
Is that the biggest factor that poverty is playing for these people for increased accelerated mental health symptoms?
So
Not being able to.
it's likely both. So it might be that some of those increased mental health symptoms that you saw before were the result of untreated mental health concerns. Entirely possible. But some of that's a little difficult to really parse out from the data. But still very much so a possibility. And so knowing that, a lot of my research lately has been trying to figure out how do we address some of those barriers and still provide effective PTSD interventions. A little bit of background on that, potentially why we see so many barriers. So typical PTSD treatment, at least ones that seem to have some of the best efficacy data, they last between about 12 and 20 weeks. That means you're going an hour a week, every week. If you don't miss, go all the way through 12 to 20 weeks. For those who, want to do the math on it, that's roughly 3 to 5 months. 3 to 5 months of consistently doing that. And trying to imagine somebody doing that who has, as we're facing right now with some of the people not being able to show up for work, what happens if you're an hourly worker, right? And what happens if you don't have as much flexibility within your job? So probably not surprising, 25 to 40% of folks, depending on what study you're reading, actually as many as 50%, but most estimates are more in the 25 to 40% range, drop out. They don't finish. And there's pretty robust evidence that finishing treatment it is really important for receiving the full effect of the intervention. And even within this, we see that some Latinx folks do receive these interventions. It does appear effective, but dropout remains high, potentially a little bit higher than what we see in non-Latinx populations. And so in part to address some of these barriers, not necessarily among Latinx folks, but just in general, Denise Sloan, who is out at Boston, the National Center for PTSD, developed a protocol called written exposure therapy. It builds on a vast amount of literature on expressive writing, and James Pennybaker at the University of Texas is kind of the godfather, grandfather, however you want to think of him in that work. But in the formalized WET protocol that Sloan and colleagues developed, 5 sessions, last about 45 minutes. And the largest component of this is that somebody writes about the traumatic event for 30 minutes without the clinician present. And though all of those details are key for thinking about how do we potentially get these kinds of interventions out of the traditional mental health office and into other places. But before we make that leap of getting it into those other places, efficacy data, sorry, I forgot this slide was in here. Treatment's effective, dropouts much lower. Important things to know. But before we jump into trying to take this efficacious treatment with potentially lower dropout, we want to make sure, or translate it to other environments, we want to make sure that it, as it's written now, seems to work for the population, at least that I want to use it with, which are Hispanic, Latinx immigrants primarily. And so my team, really when I first got here, I think even starting the second semester I was here, Sarah, did you participate in this initially? I can't remember.
I remember starting to translate some of this stuff and starting to get everything started, but
Didn't finish it.
we're doing, yeah.
Okay. So Sarah was initially an undergrad research assistant with my team when I first started, and she was a senior. But nonetheless, with a 5-member team, including myself, a variety of different Latin American Spanish dialects represented, we went through and translated the entire protocol and went through forward and back translation and used what's called kind of a consensus building process where we all look through the protocol all together. We do an even more robust version of this now with some of the things that we do. But it takes a long time, but it's hopefully makes the protocol itself much more intelligible. And we take that new protocol and then we pilot it with a mixed methods approach. So assessing like quantitative symptom reduction, so how much of their PTSD symptoms coming down, as well as like, would you use it? Would you not? What do you like about it? What would keep you from using it? That kind of thing. And so for this, they just need to meet criteria for likely PTSD, need to be from some sort of Latin American country, and have Spanish as a primary language. Within Latin American country, do include Puerto Rico, though I realize that Puerto Rico is a part of the U.S. And what is it that it's, that Puerto Rico is domestic in a foreign sense is the official Supreme Court language on it.
It's kind of awesome.
Sure.
That doesn't make any sense.
I have no idea what that means. I don't think anybody else does, but they said it's not a colony. It's not the same as other territories or a state because it is domestic in a foreign sense.
It's like we're monogamous in a casual dating sense, right?
Yes.
It's like,
Yep. Yeah. So they, nonetheless, because of that sort of
They get to be.
colonial relationship where they kind of are,
they get
in
to
some
be
ways,
other
their own thing.
people, but we're not. That's what I hear.
And Spanish is the primary language spoken, they get to be included. Importantly, for this first phase, they didn't have to be seeking treatment because we want to make sure we're getting people who may not be showing up in other studies and getting their feedback as well. So we present the protocol, ask for feedback, assess symptoms, ask about treatment use history. Then we offer them the protocol, let them go all the way through it. And then with either me or a graduate student that I'm supervising, and then within a week of them finishing the treatment, we go back and assess, okay, now you're done with it. What did you think? What would keep other people from using it? And then asking about symptoms. So these are just sort of some background on our sample. Not surprisingly, most of our folks were from Mexico. What is a little bit surprising is that we had a pretty significant representation from other countries. At least I find that surprising in this area because I don't know that gets reported on as much. That's definitely what we've seen in a couple samples now. Most people have never received any kind of mental health services before. And then most people were also within a clinical symptom range. So 1 or 2 people did not meet that criteria and weren't eligible to continue with the treatment. But almost everybody else was eligible with significant PTSD and most even with significant depression symptoms. That's what I just said. So stepping through what happened with this, we go through that phase 1 with all 20 people. Everybody's like, this is great. We want to receive this. 2 people weren't eligible, mostly for symptom criteria. 16 of those 20, so 80%, it's in the first session. Of those, all but 3 go through to completion. So in this, we get a little bit higher dropout than what we see in some of those other trials. Not by much, it's still lower than what we see in other PTSD trials. And importantly, all 13 people who had initially met criteria for PTSD did not at the end of the study. And this is what their symptom reductions kind of look like. Some are steeper than others, but pretty uniformly, we're getting some symptom reduction across everybody. And that symptom reduction is significant both statistically, so those magical p-values, as well as from a clinical significance perspective. So a drop of about 10 points is considered clinically significant. And what we can see here is this is the average drop of that chart I just showed you, right? But even if we take the 16 people who initially started the treatment and take the 3 people who started but didn't finish, take their scores and move them forward and say, we'll just assume they didn't get better at all, probably isn't true. We'll assume they didn't get better at all. We still see that 16.5 point reduction, still very much so exceeding clinical significance thresholds. Statistical significance, p-value stuff. It's what those charts kind of looks like. Gives you another idea of symptom reduction. The first one was PTSD symptoms. This one is depression. So we see significant symptom reduction in both. For the qualitative portion, so when we ask, like, what would keep you from using this treatment? The most common one was really related to what we would call like the exposure-based nature of the treatment. So having to confront the traumatic event. As we see in this one quote, prefería no recordar, which basically means I prefer not to remember. And then we see some stigma barriers. Personas piensan que estamos locos por usar la terapia. People think we're crazy for using therapy. And then only by 2 of those initial 20 participants did we have anything related to literacy, and really only one was related to literacy. Another one was kind of different about people not being able to express their emotions in writing, but the literacy concern that we see that's kind of most representative of a literacy concern is yo no sé escribir, estuve en la escuela pero no aprendí nada. I don't know how to write. I went to school, but I didn't learn anything. Quite sad, but put in kind of humorous way. And then when we look at people who actually completed, what's interesting is, even though I just mentioned that having to confront the traumatic event was perceived as a barrier, most people who went through it were like, most helpful thing, I had to confront the traumatic event. I didn't necessarily like it, but it was great and it was really helpful. And then what we see here is after we get past that, it's really, even for our intervention where we were pretty flexible about scheduling, there are fewer sessions that people have to attend. That's still basically the biggest barrier that we see. Hooray, it's effective. Seems pretty culturally congruent. And maybe some of that is the translation process. We had a pretty robust translation team relative to other translation efforts. We've since gone back based on feedback and made it even more robust, including based on a lot of work from people in this room. Yeah. So that's what I've been working on with the web proposal, or with the wet treatment. One of the things I want to do next is really try to bring this into integrated care and start trying to find ways to integrate this within technology. And this is a portion of my research background that I'm not presenting on today, but done work testing mental health in primary care, and these much more efficient models that still seem to lead to symptom reduction. And based on that, what we were planning on doing today, actually, until coronavirus happened, was going out and training integrated behavioral health providers in primary care. And then using a somewhat similar mixed methods approach to try to assess feasibility of doing it in this environment, and then maybe some longitudinal symptom tracking, to actually see if gains are maintained, and potentially comparing those who receive the treatment versus those who don't. So that's now on the back burner until about June, assuming we've reemerged by then and things are better.
Touch.
I'm sorry?
I said, where's some wood to touch?
Yeah.
Touch wood.
I don't know if this is,
I
Not
don't
this
know.
building.
That's not really. Yeah, but hopefully that's what we're able to do. That's the plan. We've got a primary care clinic on board. It's been a great clinical partner, and yeah, so that'd be the next step. What's critical about this is that really integrates us in a pretty unique clinical setting that's incredibly different from traditional mental health care. So I just described and kind of made fun of what many clinical psychologists, including myself, do from time to time, which are these hour a week for 3, 6 months, maybe a year, some people lifetime. And while we would never want to replace that system, what we clearly see is that most people don't use it. And many of those people can't use it. And so when I was in graduate school, and what I'm training students to work in now is a much more integrated care setting where we have mental health professionals function as primary care professionals. This is a public health focus. You're trying to reach as many people as possible rather than the traditional care model, which is about the person that's in front of you. You are responsible for making sure they get better. Doesn't matter anything else that happens. It's your responsibility. Make them better. This is much more about what is my most efficient allocation of time and who can I reach and have the greatest benefit. And so because of that, you have 23 to 30-minute visits and up to 6 visits. The mental health needs are identified same day, so primary care provider. In an ideal world, they're doing a really great job assessing mental health problems, and then they pass it off kind of like we see in this picture here. These are actually some friends and colleagues of mine. It's my favorite physician I used to work with in graduate school. A very brief, funny story. When we were initially setting this up, one of our jobs is also to work with providers to help them with their communication with patients, which included an incident where he walked in with somebody who was walked in with me because he was hoping that I would help them be more compliant with their diabetes medication and diet regimen. He walks in and he kind of, I can't remember what he had in his hand, but he slams it down on a desk and goes, "Man, do you want me to cut your foot off? Because if you don't get this under control, I'm going to saw your damn leg off." I was like, no, not effective communication. I loved working with him, the great guy. But that is one of those moments that, in all honesty, for a lot of people, that seems like you're frustrated, you don't know how to communicate with somebody, and now you're trying to go to some extreme to get them to do what you're asking them to do because you can see the things coming. And one of, hopefully, our skill sets as mental health professionals is communicating about those issues a little bit better. Maybe more than a little bit.
I should take with me to talk to faculty.
Yeah.
That's kind of my approach. Slam something down.
Yeah. I don't know what the equivalent of telling faculty that you're going to saw their leg off is.
Do you want me to cut your TA off? I will cut your TA off.
Yeah.
It's more about compliance.
Yeah. Yeah. You want me to take away your ability to do research? Yeah. I don't know if that's it, but maybe that is. In any case, this is kind of our role in this environment. And my idea is that because of the way it works and because you're not in the room for most of the session, you're only doing really about 15 to 20 minutes with the person each session, and it roughly fits within this 6-visit model. So first session would be some sort of assessment, 5 sessions of writing, maybe a quick assessment like PTSD checklist at the end to make sure that things are going well, and then you'd be done. So it fits roughly within that model, and that was kind of the idea behind trying to go and do the training, which we'll see what happens there. Taking it a step further though, because we're hoping and assuming that all works out, that's a pretty feasible next step. But maybe taking it a bigger step further is trying to integrate things like WET and these other mobile mental health interventions that I haven't presented on, but that I've worked on quite a bit in my time here, is trying to fit them within primary care as well. So this mobile self-help app with disaster victims uses WET. That was actually or uses something that's very WET similar. It's not exactly WET. And there's the portion of the app that I designed. We just wrapped up the R01 clinical trial, and now we've put in a treatment development grant to take what we've used in this disaster context and a mobile mental health app that addresses PTSD, like with WET, depression, some general anxiety concerns, and sleep, right? And build that into a primary care environment. The most critical thing about that, take a step back, most critical thing about that is most likely going to be how do we find ways to actually integrate this within staff workflows and to leverage these personal relationships that people have. Right? Because the app is somewhat designed to function independently, to be downloaded during a disaster and have it go. People do the mental health assessments on their phone. They get recommendations for this component of the app's likely to be helpful. We recommend you start here. Here's some ways to start with that. And now we've got to okay, this needs to go into a person-to-person system. How do we make this function? So this is roughly the app. So when you first come into it, that top left screen is roughly what you see. You may not see as many of the things that are up there because you'll see we recommend that you use activate, write, and sleep tools. So I intentionally went through the assessment and tried to give a really symptomatic profile, so that recommend a bunch of things to me. And then once they move on from that, you have this home screen that tells them all of the things that they can be working on. And then these are kind of your front pages for the sleep intervention, which is built off of an internet cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, which seems incredibly effective. The bottom left is built off of an internet version of behavioral activation for depression, also highly effective. And then this middle one, I didn't get to pick the pictures, but I did all the rest of the writing. But that's the one that I own a bit more. And then this last one is some mindfulness things that are intended for more general anxiety. That bottom right picture I actually really likes. That seemed particularly relaxing. All right. So the question is, how do we take that and implement it within these primary care systems? And the idea is that there are some aspects of the app and the primary care system that might actually make both more efficient. So the app potentially addresses some assessment issues that are frequent problems in primary care. Primary care providers miss about 70% of mental health problems, and even the ones they try to diagnose, most of the time they get it wrong. And so this automated assessment that we already have potentially helps address that. And we can automatically say, this is the section they might need, give feedback about that to primary care staff. And that's kind of step one, right? So that's, if they just did the app, gave feedback to the primary care staff about what the app is doing, that's sort of the minimum level of care that they could get. But given that primary care staff are already addressing mental health concerns on a routine basis, what we also can do in this environment is take advantage of automated tracking that these apps typically do anyway, and look at, okay, so we introduced the app, we know these are likely problems that they're facing, but they're not using the app or they're not benefiting from it. And so in a provider-facing portal that we're proposing to build, we would give alerts to primary care staff that, hey, you need to call so-and-so, they haven't been using it. Or, hey, their PTSD symptoms haven't gotten better in the last 5 weeks. You need to check in with them, right? Or there's actually a button already where people can request that somebody call them or call. In this case, it's a disaster helpline, but we would redesign it and just reroute it for the primary care clinic so that in the app, they can just directly say, I want to talk to somebody at my clinic. And then they have options for leaving a message. We typically tell them, call if this is an emergency, call 911, don't leave a message, and do that now. In a much friendlier fashion than that, but that kind of urgent. And then the third step, which is, I would really think of as this is sort of returning to a more intensive level of services that are what patients typically get in primary care. But with the enhancement of helping guide a primary care physician to where they can send somebody for a referral. So what ends up happening most of the time is you don't have step 1 or 2, and we're stuck at step 3 where something's not working, and they have to look at a patient and go, we can try another medication. How about this antidepressant? How about this benzodiazepine? Or in the case of sleep, we've got some hypnotic medications. And that's usually the approach. But once now we know, does this person primarily speak English or Spanish? We know roughly, at least within the disorders that we're covering, what their symptoms are indicating they might need treatment for. We can give specific recommendations about where to send this person for a referral so that hopefully those referrals are even more likely to stick. And we're the only people who are reaching that level of care are the people we've already taken through these other steps and are fairly confident this other stuff's not working. They really do need this higher level of care. So that is kind of where I've been, all the things about where I hope to be going next. But I do want to thank all the people who've helped me work on all of this,